What's on your mind today, BJ?
Yeah, I have come across this the birth narrative, this sort of a difficulty, and it's kind of challenging my doctrine of inerrancy, and I'm just trying to develop that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's specifically with regard to just the account where they return back to Nazareth, and it seems as if in Luke they return back from Nazareth, I believe, after the purification rites that were performed at the temple with the sacrifice, and Matthew, they return back to Nazareth after they
go to Egypt,
left Egypt.
Right.
Yeah.
Give me let me make I've got the two passages here. I mean, I'm turning to them, and I've heard kind of these objections before, and I know I've covered them. But I can't recall all the details. But let me make a couple of comments just in general about alleged contradictions, and about the issue of inerrancy. The first thing is that it's important to understand when you're dealing with contradictions exactly what a contradiction is. And you also have to understand the nature of ancient writing, okay? So first thing is the nature of a contradiction. A contradiction is the kind of thing where the two things can't be true at the same time. In other words, it's logically impossible for them to be true at the same time. So if I affirmed that I saw Melinda in the studio on this day, and then I affirmed I did not see Melinda in the studio on that day, and I meant the same thing by see and studio in both cases. There's no ambiguity about the words. Well, that would be a contradiction because it seems like they both can't be true at the same time. But if I said I saw Melinda in the studio and I told that to you, and then I said to somebody else I saw Barbara in the studio, and it didn't mention Melinda at all, that wouldn't be a contradiction because there's no inconsistency between the two testimonies. It might be that I saw both of them, and I only told you about one and someone else about the other because that was what was relevant to our conversation. All right?
Okay.
So the reason I'm mentioning this, BJ, is there are a lot of times when people point out alleged contradictions when, in fact, they weren't meant to be. The accounts aren't contradictory. You see this in the Gadarene demoniac. In one case, it cites one demonized man. In another gospel, it cites two. Well, it doesn't say there was one and only one in one, and the other one doesn't say there's two and only two. It just talks about the demoniacs, but in one case it focuses on the individual. The other one it mentions there was another one too. That's commonly pointed out as a contradiction when in fact it isn't at all. It is it's just a bigger picture of the story. So, pardon me. We have the same thing in Genesis 1 and 2 where they think there's two creation accounts, but it looks like it's very simple to take the second creation account and see it as an expanded version of the day of creation. So there's no reason to, and it's uncharitable to call things contradictions when there is a resolution that's available. All right, and there's another thing so that's the first thing. Not all so-called alleged contradictions even qualify as real contradictions. The second thing that I mentioned is you have to keep in mind the nature of ancient like historiography. We have a certain standard of reporting nowadays that wasn't the standard then. So we report things largely in chronological order. And in the past, they reported things in sometimes thematic order to make a point. And so what you're going to find in some Gospels is you're going to see some events that are askew compared to other Gospels, as if one relates one series of events and another one contradicts it, when in fact it wasn't a series of events in time that was meant to be characterized at all by the writers. It was a collection of events that might have happened at some different times, and so one sermon or a parable that is cited might have happened at a different time, but it's collected together into one place for the purposes of theme that the writer has in mind. So,
okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Okay.
So if
more controlled by the theme of the writer rather than just a strict, rigid chronological order.
Exactly. It's exactly right. And so just because you have a different order there doesn't mean you've got you have a chronology, you have a contradiction. The authors did not intend to put it in that kind of order so that there is no contradiction that can be raised against it. The contradiction is only apparent because what we're doing is we're taking a 20th century standard and trying to impose it on texts that were not written with those sensibilities. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, one other thing that this often happens here is you can have things that are contiguous in time. That is, I should say not contiguous, I mean that are temporal related, where one thing follows the next, one thing follows the first, the second follows the first in the text, but there could be a big hole in time between the two things.
Okay.
So you can say Jesus such and said such and so, and then he said such and so. Well, right there between those two verses, it might be a week of time or a month of time has passed. The writers aren't concerned with trying to record all the information. They're trying to bring the teachings together, and that's what's relevant to them. Okay? Now, I am not looking at the text right now, and maybe you can guide me to the Luke passage. Or the Matthew passage sends Joseph and Jesus and Mary to Egypt, right?
Right. That one would be Matthew 2:22.
Okay. Let me just look at this. They rose and took the child and his mother and came to the land of Israel. And when they heard that Archelaus was reigning over, Joseph had a dream, warned by God, and off they went to. He departed for the regions of Galilee. And then, I see. The Matthew passage has him going to Galilee, and the Luke passage has him going to Egypt. Is that right?
Other way around.
Because I'm reading here. Matthew 20. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's Matthew 20. I'm sorry. Matthew 22 is when they return from Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, or from 19 to 23. I guess that paragraph.
Oh yeah, I see it. And then he goes back. Okay. Then the Luke passage. I've got it. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Then, and Luke.
Luke 2:39 is the one that says they returned from Nazareth.
All right.
They returned to Nazareth.
And when they, at the very moment she came, began giving thanks to God. And when they performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. Right. Okay. This, I think, is exactly the circumstance that I was describing before. Mm-hmm. We are given a certain sequence of events by the writer Luke. Okay, and that is, and what he's saying is that the return to Nazareth came after the temple work was done. When we read it, it sounds like it happened the next day, because he's just patching these things together. But you'll notice there are other passages, and I can't bring them to mind right now, but where we have something similar like that, and one actually that comes to mind was Jesus cursing one of the trees, and and it immediately withered, and it sounds like it withered later the next day in one case, whatever. But what's going on here is you've got Luke just citing the next relevant thing as far as he's concerned. He doesn't care about the Egypt trip. What he cares about is Nazareth and the Galilee and that whole part of Jesus' ministry, and Jesus moving on. And in fact, the next verse or so in Luke says, okay, then he grew up, and then he began preaching. He started his ministry. And so you can see how Luke is jumping ahead there. We have more detail in Matthew as to what happened, though, between the temple visit and the return to Nazareth. What we have is a side trip for 2 years or so to Egypt. So the way I look at this is that Matthew is just giving us more information that Luke was not interested in giving us.
Okay.
And again, I think this is consistent with the intentions of these writers. And in fact, if you think even yourself, when you tell stories about things that happen, you took a vacation, and so I was thinking last summer when the first day out on our vacation fishing in northern Wisconsin, I took Annabeth in the boat and she got a bug in her eye. And so I might have characterized it, she got a bug in her eye, and then we had to take her to the doctor's office. Well, we didn't take her to the doctor's office until the next day. But if I would have told you she got a bug in her eye, and then we went to the emergency room. or to the dock,
Right.
whatever. And now it would sound like I just went directly there, but that isn't what I mean. I mean that these are the sequence of events, but there was a time gap in between.
Right.
So
either way would be an accurate description of what happened.
exactly. Now,
Right.
now you might say, yeah, well, you got a time gap of maybe 10 hours, right, but not 2 years. I said, that's right, because I'm not explaining the course of her young life. I'm just explaining what happened that day. But if I were to talk to you about my life, I might say, well, I spent 4 years in Wisconsin in the early 50s, and then our place burned down. Our house burned down in 1955. And that happened. I said, and then we moved to Chicago. And then, and then I ended up going to high school in York High School in Elmhurst, Well, the fact is, we didn't move in right away when the farm burned down. We moved into the shed, for the garage for 3 or 4 months. And then we moved to Chicago, and I went to high school 18 years later, or 10 years later, whatever it is. Notice how I'm giving the larger picture, and I'm just jumping past a whole bunch of details that I don't care to tell you about.
Yeah, right.
So what I'm trying to describe here, BJ, is I'm just trying to describe that this is the way not only ancient people wrote accounts, but it's kind of the way we do things today. And it can be confusing when we read these accounts initially because we're not looking for a jump in time, but sometimes we go to other Gospels and we find information that fills in the gaps. And if we are writing the full story, we include all of those things. And that's not an unusual way to write or to record those events. That's basically what I'm saying here. It's not a contradiction. It is possible to see these things fitting together. Does that make sense to you, BJ?
Yeah. I mean, the way you just explained it to me, would you also do the same thing, like when you'd be explaining it to a non-Christian, like this idea of the doctrine of inerrancy?
Well, I actually wouldn't get into the discussion of inerrancy with the non-Christian because that's really an in-house debate, and I don't really need an inerrant Bible in order to make my case for the truthfulness of Christianity.
Okay.
I believe in inerrancy, but I don't need that. I think what I need is an historically reliable Gospels. That is, that the salient details of the Gospels, that specifically the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, that those things are largely true. And even if we can quibble about smaller points, like, well, did Jesus go to Egypt or not, that's not, from a historical perspective and theological perspective, it's not relevant. Somebody might want to bash us, for example, about inerrancy and beat us up on that because they don't like this gap or the way these read. But it doesn't change that Jesus claimed to be God and claimed to be the Messiah of the world and then died on a cross and rose from the dead, if the evidence actually demonstrates that that's the case. What I don't want to do with others is I don't want to strain at a gnat and swallow the camel. I don't want to fuss about little details that they may not agree with me on and miss the larger point. If Jesus did rise from the dead, that's the historical information that really matters the most. But I do think we have a reasonable answer for this challenge. And what I usually would do with a non-Christian, my tactical approach, would be to start with an illustration. And I might ask them to tell me, well, where did they go to high school? Or, I want them to give me some narrative, or maybe I'd give them an example like I did with you. And I want to say, see, it's not unusual for us to skip events and tell things in a certain kind of logical order, even though that there's time that's missed. That's not unusual. And if we said to somebody else something about the details that we're missing, it wouldn't be charitable or fair to call it a contradiction. It's just that there was different purposes. So I'm going to want them to see that this is the kind of thing we even do in conversation. So we shouldn't be surprised to see ancient writers do it as well.
Right.
And so now, if Luke said he never went to Egypt, and Matthew said he went to Egypt, now that would sound like a pretty straightforward contradiction, but that isn't what happens. We just get the series of events, and Luke is collapsing these events to, I think, focus on what he wants to focus on. Notice, by the way, let's see, they began to giving thanks. And verse 39, everything, and they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth, and the child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And his parents used to go to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover, and when he became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. Notice, now that does report his age there, but you notice how he jumps 12 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he's not interested in that other stuff. It's not important to the details of what he wants to get to. Make sense?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I'm glad that my problem fell right there, too. That jump there seems really... yeah.
One last thing, one last thought, BJ, and I'll let you go to bed there in Hamburg, Germany. And that is that the early Christians had these accounts, both Matthew and Luke. In the first, within 30 or 40 years, clearly they had these accounts. This didn't trouble them. And the reason it didn't trouble them is because they didn't see it as a contradiction. It's kind of like the two genealogies in Matthew and Luke, the genealogies don't match. Well, we didn't discover this 2,000 years later, like nobody saw this before. Everybody saw this and they understood what it was. One was the genealogy through Joseph, and the other one was genealogy through Mary. And in fact, when you look closely at the genealogies, you can see that that's the case.
Yeah.
So I think we have to give credit to the early readers that they weren't idiots, that they could see these things and it didn't trouble them because they realized that in the context of historical writing at the time, they understood what was going on here and it wasn't a contradiction. And it's only through kind of imposed categories that we use 20 centuries later that make it look questionable when in fact it's not a contradiction at all. All right, BJ?
Hey, thank you very much, Greg.
Okay, I'll Wiedersehen, and I don't know how to say Merry Christmas in German. You probably do, though.
Frohe Weihnachten.
Okay, I'll take that. Thanks so much, BJ.
Okay.
All the best.